So, is there a single most dangerous situation that you've been in that you can point to, or is it sort of numerous situations and numerous conflict zones? Is there something that really sticks out in your mind where you really felt, you know, just scared for your life?
I mean, I would say Gaza is the most dangerous place I've been because there is nowhere to flee. There aren't bomb shelters. Even I don't even remember basements, to be honest. One basement I remember, a family that I stayed with during the initial bombings. I stayed with them to lend moral support, and the next morning there was a big crater like 30 meters outside the house. But I mean, in Gaza, it's an exceptional situation because at any point you could be drone struck, F-16, et cetera, et cetera. And even when it isn't a time of war, being with the farmers and having the Israeli soldiers shooting, live ammunition within meters of our head and body, and just standing there, not doing the fight or flight thing, just standing there because you've made a conscious choice to stand in solidarity with these farmers or these people in these regions. So it's definitely messing with your mind because it's not healthy to stand there and have these bullets fly past you. So that was a very dangerous situation. And at any point, they could have actually killed us. So I would say Gaza is the most dangerous, but there were times in Syria as well. I mean, once outside the walls of the old city in summer 2014, I was just standing with a friend, and there were a bunch of other Syrians around, and we were leaning against the wall in the shade because it's very hot. And a sniper from Jober, from Eastern Ghouta, fired towards us about 4 rounds. And so, whereas I was accustomed to that in Gaza, when you're not mentally prepared for it, it's like, what? So that could have been, but I mean, it's just, I think everything combined. Gaza was the most extreme, but then there have been dangerous situations both in Syria and Donbass as well. I mean, when they shelled outside the Donbass Palace, so that morning I had been working in the lobby, sitting exactly where the windows were blown out. Later on, 10 minutes before that happened, I had been sitting there. I left because the music annoyed me. I went up to my room. I was working and the shelling started, and I realized the room was facing the direction the shelling was coming from, so I better get out of the room. And I went down to the lobby, was talking with journalists. The fourth bomb landed, and then because of all the coffee I'd had, I needed to visit the restroom. And that's when I literally just left the lobby. And that's when the last one that blew all the windows in landed. So, there are retrospective times like, oh, that could have been very bad. So it's a hard question to answer because it's been a lot of years
There's been so
in
many.
dangerous
Yeah.
places. Yeah.
So beyond the possible mental preparation and wearing a protective vest, what other ways do you use to try to stay as safe as possible and actually, continue providing us with coverage as safely as possible?
So I didn't actually have the protective vest until Donbass, but
Mm.
in 2022, because it was being so heavily shelled, I started because I walk most of the time. I was walking everywhere if I was in the city, and so I did start mentally thinking, okay, they are over there to the west and to the north, so I'm not going to walk on the east side of the street. Is that right? Yeah, I'm not going to walk on the east side of the street or the south if I can avoid it. If so, I would try to flank the sides of buildings where if there was a shell to come to land, it wouldn't directly strike me. Maybe there'd be shrapnel from that direction. So I realized I started doing that. That was one thing. Um, I mean, gosh, I'm trying to think of other examples. It's hard to say because if, for example, going to Gorlovka or Zaitsevo or the villages around, um, when I went back there, what month was that? September, I think. I don't remember, 2022. And I was with other journalists, and we had a taxi from Donetsk, but then we went to Gorlovka and we picked up someone from the municipality, and the car was too small for everybody. So it was either leave Nikita, a lovely Russian journalist who was martyred some months ago. I was either leave him behind or leave somebody else behind. So we decided we'd leave the driver behind, and I drove. And so that was very interesting because I learned on stick shift, so that was fine. But then I was still cognizant of the fact we're going to Zaitsevo. The roads there are a horrible mess, so you have to zigzag around the potholes. They're so bad. And so I'm driving, zigzagging, trying to listen and understand what's being said. and cognizant that the shelling could happen at any time. But that's just a situation where, you don't know if it's going to happen. You can either stay back and just not go, period, or you risk it happening and then deal with it when it does happen. So I don't know. There's not really that many safety measures you could take. What I did do was I took an emergency first aid course so that I learned the basics of using, now what's the word in English? What's the word in Russian?
Tourniquet?
A tourniquet, yeah.
Tourniquet, yeah.
Yeah, so there's different types of tourniquets, but there's a basic like stretchy plastic one that I used to carry on the front of my body armor, so that if I or somebody else was injured, I could at least put that around, their arm or leg and try to cut off the flow of blood and keep them from bleeding out. That was one thing. That was one preventative thing I did, yeah.
So when you initially started going to these conflict zones, what was the reaction from your friends and family?
They were concerned, but they didn't tell me not to go.
So they understood the drive sort of behind wanting to experience that firsthand and let the world know, basically. Yeah, okay.
They did, but when I came back from the West Bank at the end of 2007, I think my dad did say something like, "Hey, you might be more effective if you stayed here and did stuff on the ground here." And I understood what he was doing, but I also said, well, I'm not really an organizer. There are people, that's their role, and they're really good at it. And I guess I realized I was okay at going to places and reporting what I was seeing. So he never told me not to go, but I knew he was very concerned about me, obviously. But yeah,
it's interesting. I'm glad they didn't intervene actively, or else we would not be seeing all your reporting had there been more of a pushback. Is there the story that you just told about the ballerina who died in the shelling was very very vivid. It's just the way you describe it, I can picture it in my mind. Is there a particular story, one story, or perhaps a number of stories from all the places you've been to that you keep coming back to, maybe keep reevaluating or keep imagining, that really, got to you in some way? I know it's a difficult question because
actually, no, there is one. When you said, so I was thinking there's so many stories, but when you said got to me in some way, yeah, the medic I mentioned, Arafa, so the one that told me not to cry, and he was a lovely man. He was very funny and goofy and very courageous. He actually was a volunteer medic. He was a high school, maybe science teacher. I'm not 100% sure, but it's a high school teacher by profession, and he volunteered for like a decade as a medic. And so one night, I don't remember, early January, one of the nights, we went to a high school that had been bombed, and we went there to see if we could, if anybody needed saving or retrieve remains. But it was, they have bare bones ambulances, and the headlights, they didn't have proper searchlights. So we're driving in northern Gaza, very dangerous, with drones and F-16s overhead, going to a place that has just been F-16'd, and we don't have proper search equipment, and the roads are like have been bombed, so the roads are rutted. And so we're driving, and I have some footage, not a lot of it, but I have some footage of driving along this fence, and like we eventually reach a point where we realize we can't go any further, we can't see anything, we can't do anything. So we wait and we go back at dawn. And at dawn, we go back to the same point. There's a massive crater in the road, which we couldn't have gotten past. They park the ambulance, and we go by foot. Arafa, I think 2 other medics, and I wasn't carrying the stretcher or anything. I was just documenting. And we go, and they find the remains of the late teen night watchman who'd been in the school, been killed. They retrieve his remains, and it's a very anyway, the scene is like, it's a school. There's a playground here. There's like a child's notebook on the ground. Everything's been bombed. There's the remains of this person, this teenager, and they carry him back to the ambulance. And the ambulance has a flat tire, and there's F-16s and drones overhead, and they're scrambling. So they put as they carry the body. I remember we passed a child who was probably like, I don't know, hard to tell how old he was, maybe 6, 7, or 8. And one thing that disturbed me was he was just standing there watching. It was so normal for him. And I think he had a piece of bread in his hand. And he was just kind of chewing on the bread and watching this. And I wasn't, it's not a judgment of him. It's just the fact that this is, become so normalized for him. And kids, they'd be like, they'd know from the sound where there was an F-16 or, what kind of warplanes. That's obviously just disturbing. But that's not the thing that got me, is that after we left that scene, then we went to, whatever hospital morgue and dropped the body off. And then I went back to Gaza City. As I said to you, I was dividing my time. I would see some things, have experiences, document things, and I go back to try to blog about it. And in that interim, this medic, Arafa, went out on another call, and he went with another young medic, and they were going to a place that there had been another bombing. One person was dead. Somebody else was injured. He was standing in his uniform at the back of his ambulance, and an Israeli tank shelled him with a dart bomb. So he was shredded and died. So that is one thing that I always thought, like, I should have been with him. But, even if I had been, I wouldn't change the situation.
Yeah, I think what I'd perceive as the targeting of medics and journalists, right, that we've seen in this most recent iteration of the conflict there has really been striking, because it's I think it's so much better documented, again, with people on the ground than perhaps before, that it really puts things into perspective.